Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jay. I am going to change folks who have called in into non-listen only mode because we do need to have the ability for you guys to ask questions. So as I go here, everybody should be able to chime in. I believe I've unmuted Erin and Sarah. Are you guys there?
Yep, Sarah's here.
Erin's here.
Awesome. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. Those of you who are already in attendance who have not called in, feel free to use the phone call information on the side of our GoToWebinar control panel, and you should be able to call in if you want to have input vocally when we go through this tool for the process for monitoring. If you don't want to, you can still use the chat box in the side for questions, and you'll see the questions drop down, and you can type them in and I'll try and field them as well. But I anticipate someone might want to just say something. So if you want to put yourself on mute on your phone terminus, that's great. And we'll get started in a minute or two. I do still expect about 2 other people to come on. Since I have everyone on except for a couple folks, can someone out there in vacation land tell me that you can see the screen with the tool in front of you?
Yeah. I see it.
Swedish. Thank you. All right, folks, we're going to give them one more minute, and if they don't hop on, then we are going to plow ahead and respect your time. So sorry for the delayed start. Just in case you have anyone who is not in attendance that you know still needs this material, I am actively recording this webinar and will be able to distribute a link to it in short order following today's conversation. So we'll just wait one more minute and then we'll rock and roll. Alrighty, I think that is enough time to have given folks an opportunity. Hopefully someone will still jump on and join us, but to all of you who are here already, thank you very much for your time and your energy in preparing for the site visits that we'll do for Southern New Jersey Continuum of Care. For those of you who are on the phone and are unmuted, have you ever done these SNJ CoC or Continuum of Care monitorings before?
I have not.
No, this is my first. This is my first.
So that's Erin and Sarah, both first timers. So thank you very much. I think that you know it is going to have some more intensive ins and outs than maybe some of the others that you may have done in the past. Can you and I'll just call you out, Erin, have you done any other types of monitorings before for housing-oriented programs?
Social service monitoring.
Okay,
so I've done monitoring for their wraparound services.
Okay. And Sarah, how about yourself?
I do the HSAC monitoring for the funding received for that. But we're not doing housing programs, but the monitoring tool actually looks the same, so.
It is very similar, right? Yeah, it was adapted to look in a similar format to that tool by the folks at CPAC. So, you know, there are some definite distinctions. There are some other folks on the phone or listening in, but they're not audible. So we're just going to go ahead and keep moving. I'll check the questions box in case anybody does respond. But yeah, basically the site review logistics will be probably similar to others that you've done. You're going to go and have a site where folks are going to meet you, be talking in generalities about some of the stuff, you know, and you're going to have an initial meeting, but there should already be a number of items gathered for you. Based on the number of participants in the program, there should be half of all participant files. Each program that is operational for the continuum of care should have, each agency operating a type of program should have a project policy and procedure manual. So for instance, at CPAC, they have a number of different rental assistance, and I think they're all leasing programs actually. And so those programs, that you're only required to have one manual per type of program. So you just need to make sure that they have a policy manual in order for the procedures of operating the project. There's a data collection tool or HEMIS intake, which they should have on hand in those participant files. The ELOC's drawdown documentation. So that basically is a list of the drawdowns that have been made from the federal system that where HUD distributes and disperses the monies for the continuum of care program. So those should be available for the last operating year when you come in the door. Project or staff timesheets to show either the match, well, both the match documentation as well as the information regarding why they've drawn down, you know, certain expenses. So that should be in order. Most recently signed HUD grant agreement. So that's just their agreement with HUD signing over the monies to contract with them for the housing services. The HUD cover sheet of the contract, which should detail the level of service or the number of units as well as the match requirement. The most recently submitted application that they sent to HUD via eSnaps. Why this is important is because you will just need to make sure that they are serving the exact number, or at least the minimum, the number that they committed to serve in their HUD application. Okay, so that Exhibit 2 is really called the project application. So for instance, if you're monitoring a rental assistance program, it will say you're supposed to have served at least 10 persons in 10 one-bedroom units or something along those lines. Documentation of timely APR submission. What they may do for that is show you a printout from the Sage HMIS system, or it may just be their most recently submitted APR for you to view. Program subcontracts or MOUs with partners. So for instance, in some of CPAC's projects and also with HMFA or DCA, they are the recipient of funds. However, they also have partners who are providing wraparound services. So they're paying rent, but maybe they're not the ones that are providing the mental health treatment services. So for instance, in the case of DCA, they are the recipient of a number of CoC projects in Southern New Jersey, but they are not the sponsor entity providing the social services. So the support services in some cases are provided by Cape Counseling and in some cases by Robin's Nest. So you're going to need to make sure that they do have an active memorandum of understanding and agreement with those partners to arrange those roles and responsibilities. Documentation of staff HMIS training, that could be the certificates of completion, it could be documentation on the timesheets that folks actually did spend going to a training, and if we need to, we can also follow up with Mike Dundas about that if we have questions about any of that documentation, our HMFA partner who does our HMIS. And then recent grants closeout certification. Basically, at the end of each operating year, HUD sends a letter to every grantee saying, this is how much you were awarded, this is how much you spent, is this correct? And can we recapture the balance that you did not expend? Obviously, our goal is to try to have our grantees expend as much of or all of the monies that are allocated to them. The realities of a rental assistance program are such that it does make it tricky sometimes, and many of our folks are operating these very, kind of very programmatically, very straightforwardly, and so there's maybe not as much flexibility in spending down extra dollars. So there should be some documentation of closeout certification and whatever funds are left over from the most recent closeout. Okay, there may be some projects that get monitored that don't have closeout certifications. We do have a couple of new programs that were awarded in recent competitions. So just we'll keep an eye out for that and make sure you're prepared when you're going on your visits, either myself and or the staff at CPAC. All right, so basically we're going to review some of these documents in an initial meeting together. If there's questions, orient yourself to the materials. Where's the project policy manual? Can you point out where the conflict of interest policy is, etc.? Make sure that you are looking for all of those pieces that are kind of the programmatic level. And then you can interview the program staff regarding the services and staff training section. And then I believe that there's a protocol in that when CPAC is reaching out and scheduling these meetings, that they set that expectation of, where and when and how any site visits might be conducted, and if there's a need to discuss or reach out to any clients in particular during the visit. So you'll have that information hopefully at the ready from the agency as you're working through that conversation with them, and make sure you know where and how you would be ushered to, see a unit and make sure it meets the housing quality standards, etc. And then completing the monitoring tool, as you can see, is pretty straightforward. We're going down, we're looking at these questions, and then we're going to be sending a findings report as soon as you have completed the monitoring visit, I think that the guidance is also that there could be a exit interview. I always like to have a conversation with folks on the way or before you're on the way out the door in order to ensure that there's no surprises in that findings letter. The overall goal of this monitoring isn't to make people feel bad about themselves or to like judge them on how they're operating the program. Ultimately, what we are trying to ensure is that they are in compliance and that they're operating the program correctly to serve consumers, because we want them and we want ourselves as a continuum of care to make sure that these monies are in good hands and to make sure that they're being used effectively, because we don't want HUD to come out and monitor our agencies and have them find a basket case. Okay, we want to be able to help folks be prepared, that we'll ask a lot of the same questions that HUD would be asking, and make sure that they're prepared and have that documentation together. All right, so we're going to move on. In terms of the procedures, there's going to be program representatives that are expected to be there. There'll be monitoring team folks in front of, alongside of you, and then obviously those documents. I don't think we need to kind of go over the step-by-step. We kind of already did that. This is the tool itself. This is just the information that's going to be sent for folks' information so that they're prepared. And then this is the actual just top of the monitoring tool. Just going to check off the information, make sure you put in the information of who you're monitoring and what folks are along with you for the ride. And then we're going to get into the meat of the tool itself. Okay, as Sarah pointed out, it's very similar to the HSAC monitoring tool, but I do want to point out some differences as we go through. This, I think, section is almost entirely lifted from an HSAC tool in Camden County in terms of the program environment. Just making sure that the physical location is observed as accessible and in good repair. For instance, if there's a place where clients are meeting with folks, we want to make sure, especially since the continuum of care programs are probably serving folks with disabling conditions, that it's an accessible location, if at all possible, and that it's safe. The program environment hopefully is maybe private, if there's counseling or mental health treatment or other forms of supportive services being provided, that the activities are reflective and culturally sensitive to the population being served, that staff are actively and appropriately engaged with participants. So that may be that section where you might want to do a survey with a client, or discuss with a client directly, if that's been arranged via CPAC and the agency corresponding prior to your visit. Okay, you can see that the measurements here are kind of here. They're saying yes, no, or not applicable. And then you can provide comments here as necessary. Later on, I just want to point out, it's going to change to standard met, okay, standard not met or not applicable. So this is more of just saying we have a standard and we need to make sure that those standards are met. So it's a little bit more than just saying yay or nay. It's a little bit more kind of a thumb up or a thumb down in terms of meeting a standard, not just whether or not it's nice to have a sensitive and private environment. Those are more requirement oriented. In terms of the program services here, program has the ability to meet the service needs of non-English speaking participants and families. That is a big focus of HUD right now. So we want to make sure that we know what their policy is, what their staffing capabilities are, and their capacity to serve folks who might not have easy access to services because of a language barrier. Individual service plans created. This one is probably going to be something you're looking for in client files. So in every client file, in addition to information about their income, about their basic identifying information and their eligibility, meaning that they're homeless, and in many cases it's a requirement that they be disabled, so that documentation should be in there. But each program file should also include documentation that someone met with this person, assessed the needs that they have that will enable them to maintain their housing permanently, and that there are service plans that are updated, hopefully on an annual basis, and that those services that folks are receiving are based on that plan. So if there's documentation of meeting with a mental health treatment provider because their mental illness is one of their barriers, or they want to, promote wellness in their life, those are the types of things that you'd be looking for. There's not a one-size-fits-all or a one-template way to go in terms of documenting services, but you want to make sure that there are services being provided and documented in the file. If there's nothing there and they say, oh, well, we document it using our tracking system or it's in HMIS, then you can ask for that documentation. Ask someone to go and, provide it to you if possible, and see what they have. In terms of clients having services that are tracked and recorded through staff timesheets, that is something that, again, it should be in maybe possibly partially in the client file where, there may be a client tracker or tracking sheet where it has dates by month, and it shows, okay, this is initialed here because there was a meeting or a case management session between this staff person and this client on this day. However, also, it would be, let's say that this program has a supportive services budget item. So there are some programs that, in addition to receiving rental assistance or leasing assistance, which are helping folks pay for their housing directly, there are some programs that also have a line item for supportive services, which help them pay case managers or staff that are helping folks maintain housing. And those are going to need to be documented and tracked by staff timesheets in order to show that they can draw down monies from that supportive services line item. So that may be partially in client files, but it'll also be partially outside of client files and probably in just a staff timesheet. Whatever human resources tracking device they have, whether it's paper or something digital that can print out a timesheet. Staff person responsible for meeting educational needs of children and families in the program. Okay, so this may be in a job description if they have a policies manual saying that the role of the case manager includes meeting the educational needs of children and families. This may be, something where they are pointing to the evidence that they have a call listed with the McKinney-Vento liaison or the school district or whoever else that the staff is making sure that the educational needs of children and the families is met. This is only applicable, obviously, to families with children, but it is a requirement. It could also be in their policies and procedures manual as opposed to a job description, right, where it says, if there is anyone served who has a child in our rental assistance program, someone will be in charge of meeting their educational needs of the children. Okay, so that's where you'd be looking for that information. Participant service needs are assessed and updated at least annually, right? We mentioned that we're looking for at least an annual note that someone revisited with the client their goals and their service needs on an annual basis and made updates accordingly. Just so you know, I'm just going to keep pressing on until someone yells at me and has a question. So feel free to just jump in at any time. Okay. All right. So section 3, participant files. Just so everybody knows how I have done this in the past using this tool, you can see here that there's just kind of check boxes in these 3 columns that say SM, which would be standard met, SNM, which would be standard not met, and NA. And the way that, and you can see up here, it says total number of participant files reviewed, right? So they're going to provide you with, at minimum, 50% of the client files for that program. So let's say it's a 20 client, or 20 unit project that's going to house 20 homeless persons or formerly homeless persons. And so you get 10 participant files. Okay, what I typically try to do is I try to use this space, instead of just providing a check mark, I usually use a tally mark, right? So, let's just kind of put it here. What I would do, and I just highlighted it here, but what I would usually do is something along these lines. I'd probably do a tally that says, I reviewed this, there was 1 standard met, And then if I went over here and there was any that didn't meet the standard, I would say 1 standard not met. And so I'd be able to track, okay, I had 1 standard met and 1 standard not met. And ultimately we would hope that there would be 9 met and 1 not met, or hopefully all of them met, right? And then I would track it as a percentage. And in my comments, I would put, of course, I can't put it in the comment section over here, but I would put over here in the comment section that I had 90% met the standard. Okay, so that's the way that I would usually do these for each of these items, and try to just make sure I'm keeping track of how many of the files I've reviewed and whether or not they meet the standard. Okay, so first line here is file contains completed up-to-date HMIS consent forms. Okay, there only needs to be 1 HMIS consent form completed, and as long as it's not more than 5 years old, it is up to date. Okay, so as long as it's not more than 5 years old, it should be good to go. That's what up to date means. Okay, file contains a valid lease, if applicable, and program occupancy agreement or participation agreement signed by participants. All right, so one of the things that you will need to make sure you know, and I'll just put it out there for everyone to make sure that you hassle either myself or CPAC, or you have the tools to do it yourself. But one of the things that they're preparing for you is their most recent application that was submitted to HUD in eSnaps. Now, what that will show you is what type of project it is, okay? If it is a leasing project, okay, if it's what's called a leasing project, and I'm just going to put this in here as a comment because I'm clearly just getting flustered and frustrated here. All right, so let's see if I can put some text in here for you. Okay, so leasing, you're going to need to have a lease in both client and agency name. Okay, so what you're going to need to make sure you have is that not only is the client's name on the lease, but also an agency entity that is co-signatory on the lease or co-party on the lease with that client. Okay, the same thing would go for sponsor-based, and I'm going to put it in here, leasing/sponsor-based rental assistance. Okay, that's what you would need, is a lease in both agency and client name. And if it is a leasing program, you got to look for that on the leases. It must be there. It cannot just be in the tenant's name. That is not going to be a valid lease. Okay. Now, in terms of rental assistance, that would just be a lease in tenant's or client's name. Okay, so it's really important to take a look at that when you are looking at the leases. Depending on what type of project you're talking about, the requirement of the lease is different. So you'll probably have to, fast forward through the first few pages of the lease agreement to the back of the lease agreement. And if it's a leasing or a sponsor-based rental assistance project, which you'll be able to tell by the application, lease must be in both client and agency name. If it's just rental assistance, which would be tenant-based or project-based, you'll just need a lease in the client's name. Okay. For 3.3, the file containing client identification, obviously you'll just be able to see whether that information is in the file. Okay, so take a look through that. The file contains documentation for verification of homeless status. Okay, so this is a really important one because what we need to do is, again, reference the application. Okay, because in the application, you may find that this project is committing to serve chronically homeless persons. Okay, if that's the case, then chronically homeless persons, you must have a chronic homeless documentation. Okay, but there's some that are just homeless. And so what you need to make sure of is that you're not holding folks to, and I'm sorry, I put this in the wrong row, of course, you're not holding people to a standard that is not necessary for them, but that you're also looking out for a standard in case it should not be met. So for the homeless documentation, you're just looking for documentation that this person came from emergency shelter, street, or transitional housing. Okay, and emergency shelter includes a hotel or motel paid for by an agency. Okay, so if there came from a hotel motel placement that was inclusive of a board paid for hotel motel placement from the Board of Social Services, that is totally kosher. From the street, obviously, would be unsheltered, and transitional housing would be a transitional housing program for homeless persons. Now, how do you document that someone was on the street? It's not good enough just to interview someone and say, did you come from the street? Typically, what we would want to see at a minimum is that there is some form of either effort on behalf of the case manager to try to identify where this person actually was prior, and that would mean that they would be able to show that they had made a phone call to a police department or to a location where that person had said they had stayed, and they can document those calls to show that they had reached out. At best, you would have a letter from a outreach staff person to show that this person actually was actively engaged on the street and was staying in an unsheltered location. So you're going to have to make sure that you take, did all of this writing just go away? There we go, sorry. You're going to have to make sure that you take a look at that on the street homeless documentation. For emergency shelter, it could be a HIMIS record. It could be that there was a letter from an emergency shelter provider. You're talking about that kind of third-party documentation. And transitional housing, same thing, either HMIS documentation or a letter. Now, if there is just a self-certification, okay, that is acceptable, but it's best to have at least 75% of the homeless episodes or the homeless length be from a third-party documentation, okay? So I also got a question here that says, for housing, can a letter be provided by someone that knows the living situation? And the answer would be yes. And if so, does it have to be notarized? So that's a good point. If there's a self-certification that you can actually get a self-certification, really it should be notarized by a notary public in order to be kind of valid, because then it's got some legal authority that the person actually attests to that, the truth of that statement. The other question I have is self-certification only valid for 3 months? So that goes to this question of the chronic homeless documentation, because if you're just trying to look for homeless documentation for a project that's not targeting chronically homeless folks, all you have to prove is that they came from a homeless location and they have a disabling condition. For chronic homelessness, you have to document that they had 4 episodes in the last 3 years, totaling 12 months, or that they've been homeless for the past 12 months consecutively, okay? So that 4 episodes, 3 out of those 4 episodes, according to HUD standards, should be documented and not just self-certified, okay? With the 12-month standard for chronic homelessness, same thing. Should really only be self-certifying for 3 months, okay, out of that 12-month, requirement. So if you have letters showing that this person was in shelter for 9 months, but they self-certify that they were on the street for 3 months, that meets the standard by HUD's definition. Okay, so there are those types of ins and outs that are very nitty-gritty, and hopefully either, again, myself or the folks at CPAC will be able to make sure that we keep those things in mind when you're looking through the file. But another thing to consider is that 75% third-party documentation standard only really got published by HUD in 2016. So if the person was admitted to the project in 2015 or earlier, really should not make a stink about it. We should just remind folks that we actually do have a new standard from HUD, and that in the future they're going to be making sure that people have that 75% of third-party documentation. Okay? And I'm just going to go back because I got another question about master leases. So it's a great question. So for leasing, as you can see here, it says valid lease or participation agreement signed by participants. So in some cases with leasing programs, what they do is they do what's called master leasing, okay, which essentially performs the same service as co-signing a lease. So instead of the lease being between the client and a landlord, the lease is going to be between the agency and the landlord, you know, or the sponsor agency and the landlord. So for instance, in the case of CPAC's projects, they have some projects with VOA as the sponsor, Volunteers of America, and they are the lessee on the grant, or excuse me, on the lease. And then they have a sublease or a separate occupancy agreement with the between the sponsor agency, VOA, and the client. So that is also acceptable for leasing and sponsor entities. So I appreciate the question. Okay. So for disability, for verification of participant disability, it's required for permanent supportive housing programs that you do also get to potentially, if you're monitoring CFS, monitor one rapid rehousing program, which they have. For the rapid rehousing program, there is no requirement for disabling condition. Okay. However, the vast majority of our programs are permanent supportive housing projects, and they do require documentation of participant disability. So that could be something signed off by a licensed clinician showing that the disabling condition that they suffer from, whether it's physical or chronic health or mental illness, is going to be of a long-term duration and inhibit their ability to live independently. All right, so I'm just going to put that up as a note. Okay, so it's got to be long-term, signed off by clinicians, and inhibit independence so that they might not be able to live independently. Okay? Documentation, and that's for every household, has to have at least one member that has the disability. I just keep putting stuff in the wrong row, so you got to forgive me. Okay, documentation and verification for chronic homeless status. Okay, we just kind of went through that. There is a distinction, however, for participant disability. If you have a non-chronically homeless program, the disabling condition could be of any household member. Okay, so if you have a mama and a baby, and the baby has a disabling condition, and they were homeless prior to entry, they are eligible, even if the mom is not disabled. However, if it's got to be a chronically homeless mama and baby, it has to be the mama that has the disabling condition. Okay, so for chronic homelessness, there must be an adult member of the household, at least 18, who has a disabling condition documented for chronic homeless. Documentation for all income sources. So the way that most of these programs are operating is that if you are going to provide rental assistance or leasing assistance, that the person who is being assisted must contribute 30% of household income to rent. Okay, so in order to know what 30% of their household income is, you need to document all the sources of income. So there should be either big bank statements or checks or a letter from the federal government showing their SSI benefits. All of those are valid forms of documentation of income. So you'll definitely be wanting to look for that in each client file, that there's something documenting that. Okay, file contains documentation for all income information updated. Okay, so it should be updated at least annually. So if the documentation in the file is more than 12 months old, you know, you should be just checking with folks that they are doing the annual updates. Okay, file documentation is accurate rent calculations. Okay, so again, this goes to the 30% of household income toward rent. You're going to want to make sure that the rent calculation worksheet is completed in each household file. Again, either myself or someone from CPAC should be able to be saying, hey, yes, this is a rent calculation, or this is not a rent calculation. And maybe even some of our more experienced assessors or monitors will be able to recognize a rent calculation worksheet. It should be in every file. For documentation of utility allowances, that can be done separately from the rent calculation, because what this is again, we went to 30% of household income toward rent. What happens if someone has zero income? What if someone is literally bringing in $0 per month? Well, in that case, even if they have the entire amount of their rent paid for by the program, the utilities, if they're not included, might be a problem and cause the person to be evicted or live in a unit without any utilities. So for persons with very, very low income, oftentimes there will be what's called a utility allowance for them. Okay, and so what you can do is check to see that that's completed. It should be on a form that's standardized. It's usually derived from the local permanent or, public housing authority. So you can look in the files for those. They're not required in every file. But again, if you see someone with, let's say, less than, I would say about $750, and the lease agreement didn't include utilities, or at least didn't include all utilities, there's a good chance that that will need a utility allowance, and that you'll just want to look in there and see how they calculated it. Okay, summary of steps taken to verify a participant doesn't receive any other subsidies. This is not a big emphasis. This is just something I think that is part of a local HSAC protocols to see if this program is the last resort payee. The CoC is not as worried about this, but it is also good to see, hey, did this person show any documentation of how they assessed the need of the person, right? Is this person actually already receiving anything? Did something show up when we were looking for their income to document? Did we run a HIMIS consumer lookup report just to see what this person's homeless history was and whether they were in any other programs? You know, that can be a very useful piece of information. All right. File contains evidence that participants have been notified of program requirements. Now, this can be both in the client file, but also should be part and parcel of the program's policies and procedures manual or their intake protocol within that manual. So what we're looking for here is that everybody is informed of their rights, the requirements of the program, and their privacy, rights that they have, as well as any appeal process if there's any dispute between themselves and the program operator. So one of the best things that someone can do when they're operating this program is have an intake packet that includes a description of the agreement between the program operator and the client. Okay, so I can't emphasize enough, it's a really great thing. Not every program has one that is very comprehensive, but anything that says you're going to be required to pay 30% of your income, you have the right to appeal or say that you have any grievances without just being terminated out of hand. There's a process, but if you have a problem with your case manager, this is who you go to. The HIMIS intake piece should have statements about their privacy and their rights in terms of, maybe it's part of their, intake packet is some information about tenants' rights. Those are all really, really helpful things. And we're talking about a program that's assisting folks that have severe barriers to keeping housing. So it's really a benefit to the consumers if we can have this type of thing in our program operations. File has up-to-date record of services provided. Again, this is kind of similar to what was already stated in the previous section, but it's always really helpful to have something in the file showing that you can see that people are receiving counseling or assistance. Okay. Moving on to section 4, contractual obligations. Program submits programmatic and fiscal reports on time. Okay, so someone from CPAC should be able to comment about APRs being submitted on time, but again, there's also a requirement, as you saw at the beginning of our document, that they provide you with their APR. So you should be able to tell whether or not they have submitted their APR and whether it was within 90 days of the expiration of their contract. So each contract with each agency operates from a different period for a 12-month time frame. And so what that means is that maybe it started in July and goes through the end of June. So that would mean that July, August, September, their APR would be due 3 months after the expiration date of the project. So that would be by the end of September. Okay, so you can probably check that out just based on what they provide you. But if you can't make that determination in person, we can look that up subsequent to the visit. Program is on track with serving the number of participants that they are supposed to serve, right? So that's what we said before. In their contract, they said they were going to serve 20 homeless persons, but we only see based on HMIS or based on their APR or based on the number of program files that we have that they're only serving 15 people. Well, what is that about? You know, we need to make sure that we check that there is actually the level of service that's required met in order to ensure that HUD doesn't have an issue with the program operation. Documented protocol, including how long the client is tracked after discharge. This would probably mostly be for your rapid rehousing program. So I'm going to just put a note because obviously for a rapid rehousing program, this is going to be more temporary assistance. For permanent supportive housing, we're hoping that people are never discharged, or if they are discharged, that it's to another permanent housing location. So we'll say that it could be permanent supportive housing if the person moves on to other permanent location, destination. All right, HMIS documentation completed in a timely manner. Hopefully their policy handbook says within 48 hours of doing an intake, I'm going to put that information into HMIS. That would be a big benefit. You know, hopefully that's the way our programs are operating. That's technically in our HMIS data standards. So again, we're hoping that that's what people are operating with. In terms of the clients served in the project match the subpopulations, when you are looking at the application that a program has put together for HUD, it will say what subpopulations they are serving. So this could be domestic violence victims. So there would be documentation of the experience of clients having had an experience or fleeing domestic violence, whether that be a restraining order or a police report or documentation from the emergency shelter staff at the safe house, whatever may have you. That would be the documentation for that subpopulation. You could have certain disabilities identified. Okay, so this program is dedicated to persons with mental illness. Where's the documentation that they are serving persons with mental illness? It could be veterans, okay? If there are any veterans specified, well, how did you document whether the person is a veteran? So those are all, you know, important pieces. If stuff is not submitted on time is a question I'm getting in here. All right, let me just read it. Okay, so I think that I understand the question over here. Just making sure that we cover that we should be looking for those targeted subpopulations, making sure that the documentation is gathered in time, but also making sure that it shows specifically whether or not that person falls into the subpopulations identified. Same thing with, honestly, household types. Okay, sorry. Just went to the wrong page. But in terms of household types, what we want to see is that if this is a program that's dedicated to families, we want to see that there's adults and children in households together, you know, and not just all single adults. So those are all important pieces. You know, and you'll also be just looking to see, hey, was this project dedicated to chronically homeless or just to homeless with a disabling condition? So you're looking for something very specific to make sure that the folks are serving who they committed to serve in their application to HUD. We're just trying to make sure that they're living up to what they agreed to. Okay? All right. I did cover, I got another question about domestic violence documentation, but it should be, the question is, how long from the time that a domestic violence episode is experienced can that status be used, and what documentation is acceptable, right? So we did cover the documentation piece in terms of police report or restraining order or you know, a letter from the safe house saying that the person was, you know, fleeing domestic violence. the fact of the matter is that it's going to be different in all cases how long ago we should accept domestic violence documentation for. So just because someone had a domestic violence episode 10 years doesn't mean that they should qualify as homeless, right? Because they could have come from a permanent housing location, between now and 10 years ago, they might have gotten back on their feet and into housing. So we wouldn't expect that someone would be actively fleeing domestic violence for 10 years. That being said, there could be someone who has an abuser or a perpetrator that is tracking them, and they have been actively fleeing domestic violence for 6 to 12 months. I have seen those situations in terms of documentation before. So, it may be different for different situations how long ago you can accept documentation from. In general, I'd say that if you have a letter prior to their intake into the program that shows that they were fleeing and that they were in a safe house, or that they had some form of police report or formal documentation of the perpetration of violence toward the participant, that there's really no set limit on how far back that documentation has to go prior to intake, you'll probably be looking at between 6 to 12 months in most cases. Okay, 25% match in support services for all budget line items except leasing. So this is pretty simple. Basically, if I give you, and I'm HUD, if I give you $100,000 to operate this program, you need to show me, if you spend all $100,000, that you've also matched my money for every dollar that I've given you with 25 cents. So that would mean $25,000 worth of match. So let's say, though, that I gave you $100,000 and you only spent $50,000 of it. That would mean you're only required to document $12,500. So this has got to be 25%. And to document match, you could document these not just through supportive services. It could also be administrative match. Okay. Any eligible expenses that HUD could have paid for the program but didn't can count as match. And so what we're going to want to look for is, can you show, and again, we already talked about documenting the services. A lot of these programs do not receive any money for services. So most of the documentation for match is going to be self-evident. You're just going to make sure it gets to the level of meeting the match requirement. Hey, we value our supportive service staff time or our case manager's time at X dollars per hour. They spent X hours with each client approximately, and this is how we calculated the match. And not just approximate, but we can show it through the timesheets, which you've already seen, and you can see the notes in the file that prove that those services were actually completed. Okay. On the administrative side, you could also say, hey, you know what? We had 5 people move this year. So in addition to the services, it was a lot of administration, right? We had to pay landlords. We had to sign new leases. We had to do all these things that are required to keep folks housed, pay new, first month's rent and security deposits and all that jazz. So you can see that above and beyond, the $2,000 that we get for administrative monies, our staff put in at least X number of hours valued at X number of dollars, which would mean that those are match services. Anything above and beyond what you're spending from HUD's money counts as match. Okay? If it is a situation where there is a sponsor agency. So again, we talked about CPAC, DCA, there's a couple, HMFA, those folks that have dollars, but they're really just paying rents, and it's another entity, a sponsor entity or sponsor entities that are doing the support services for the clients. You will want to make sure that in order to qualify as match in those situations where it's not the entity paying for it, you must have an MOU. Okay, so we're going to put this down here. If from sponsor, must have MOU. Okay, so let's say that you have an out-of-date MOU, right? So they only signed their most recent MOU covering 2015 to 2016, and you're looking at services that were provided in 2017. They must update their MOU to be current. Okay, this is super annoying. It's very clerical, but it is HUD's requirement. So technically, if there's no MOU between an entity that's paying rents and an entity that's providing services, none of those services count toward the match. Again, I'll say it again, it's a technicality, but it is the reality, and we want to make sure our program operators are clued in, okay? Adequate documentation of support services identified for match funding. So again, we just talked about timesheets, we talked about the service notes. Really, timesheets should be signed and by the staff and dated, as well as signed by a supervisor. If HUD came in, that's the standard they would be holding people to in terms of documentation of the services time, as well as the time for admin, if they were going to be drawing down admin. So we can try to emphasize that to folks, but you know, just make sure that that's there. It's on the table. All right, next, going down to policies and procedures, okay? We want to make sure that they have a copy of the signed grant agreement that they have with HUD. If they do, it is proof that HUD has sent them a copy of the regulations, which means that really no one, even though this is a very difficult program to operate, no one has any excuse for HUD for not operating the program in compliance, because HUD sends you literally the entire book on how to operate the program in compliance with every grant agreement. Okay, policies and procedures manual for the project operation on file. So we really emphasize that they must have a program policies and procedures manual. Okay, this is less of an emphasis, but if HUD came out, they would be saying, who the heck is doing the work? You say that there should be case management services, but whose job is it? Whose duty is it? Where's the role and responsibilities and the job description to show who's got to do this and who's got to do what? Okay, so do check to see that there's a program policies and procedures manual. I realize that I haven't come up for air in a few minutes, so I'm just going to stay silent for the next 10 seconds and see if anybody wants to shout any questions out. Anybody out there have a question? Okay. Well, moving along, providers have procured and maintained in good standing all permits, grants, licenses, and insurance, including any renewals required during the term of contract, and no HUD findings. So in every interview that you do, please make sure that you ask someone from the program, do you have any current outstanding HUD audit findings? Okay, we do have some agencies in our CoC that are being monitored this year, so we want a copy. If they have been monitored, we want a copy. Okay, it's maybe, you know, intrusive, but I'm just going to write it down here. We want a copy of any findings for CoC reference. Okay, because we want to be able to look out for what HUD thinks we should be looking out for. We want to know if our agencies are operating in compliance so that we can make good funding decisions. All right. In terms of licenses and insurance, they should have insurance. If there are leased up units, hopefully, you know, they might have a copy of the certificate of occupancy. They should, at a minimum, have a documentation in those files, and I think that was an oversight of this tool, but they should have a copy of, and I'll include it here under permits, but they should have a copy of the HQS, which is the Housing Quality Standards. So I'm just going to put this here, even though it should go up earlier. So Housing Quality Standards, met standards for occupancy. There's a standard inspection that you have to do to make sure that where the folks live meets the requirements, not having lead paint, having you know, good quality, and not being decrepit. Okay. Again, we talked about having the MOUs. They should be provided to you. Conflict of interest policies. So not just a conflict of interest for, you know, the staff, but also for subrecipients. So making sure that there's no, that the program is covered and has a policy stating that the benefits to the program cannot go to subrecipient or recipient family or staff. Okay, a record that staff attended HIMSS trainings on file. Files are centrally located, accessible to designated staff members, and secure from program participants and unauthorized personnel. Okay, one of the things that was on that first page about when you go into a location, if you're at the administrative center of the project, you're going to want to make sure that you have them show you how they do lock away any available files for program participants. They need to be able to secure personally identifying information for clients in order to ensure that they are secure. Okay, it's part of the confidentiality agreement with HMIS. All right, so in addition to meeting the specific confidentiality and security requirements, the agency has a policy on client confidentiality. Okay, so they should have that in their policy manual. Client satisfaction. We're hopeful that these programs are operating not just in a vacuum, but also trying to constantly improve their programs, and that it should be done utilizing input from clients. Okay, you might want to ask, are there any former consumers or current consumers as an advisory group to the board of the nonprofit? Or if there isn't, maybe there's an advisory group if it's a public entity, right? So how are you getting client feedback on whether this is operating well? Documented policy for providing clients with a means of expressing and resolving a complaint or appeal. That's the grievance policy or appeals process that should be in the policies that they have. Documented referral process. This should now be something saying how they're getting referrals, should also be including coordinated assessment with the Southern New Jersey Continuum of Care. Folks should have updated their operations in order to include something that says, we will be receiving referrals from the Southern New Jersey Continuum of Care coordinated assessment process. Okay, if that's not done, we just remind them that this is the process. Make sure that they understand what their role is. This is a really, really timely and important piece for our continuum. Agencies completing inspections. See, I didn't even have to do it. It just came up later. All right, so we're going to need to make sure that there is an inspection in each client file, but that it's also a part of their policy to do the inspections. Environmental reviews, technically in some of our CoC permanent housing projects, there should be environmental reviews completed. It's not applicable to all programs, so you might want to just check with one of your fellow reviewers whether or not it's required before inquiring about it. It's not required for all, so that's not a huge emphasis at HUD. It's just something to raise and ask the folks if they know what their requirements are. If a project receives supportive service, operating, or administrative funds, it has appropriate documentation, including staff timesheets, payrolls required to justify drawdowns. So one of the things they're providing you is the availability, and I just got a question, so I'll answer it. It appears the webinar is going past 4 p.m. Is it going to be available to see later with notes? It won't be available with notes, but it'll be available with whatever is written here, as well as the audio. So it will be available as a webinar. I can provide it with this exact document with the notes on it as well. So if you have to jump off, you can jump off, and we'll make sure you have access to it. So justifying drawdowns, they're going to be providing you the list of the drawdowns that they've done for the current operating year. Once you've seen that, you know they've drawn down rental assistance money. They've drawn down administrative dollars. Maybe they've drawn down operating costs. So what you'll need to ensure is that they have documentation for all of those expenses. HUD wants to see that if you're drawing down $1 from their money, that you have backup to show why you drew that down. So they should not be on the first day of the grant agreement drawing down $100,000 unless they can say, you know what, this grant got started late. I had to draw down for monies back to last few months, and here's the documentation of the rents I was paying or needed to pay, and so forth. It shouldn't just be, I draw down all my money as soon as I get my grant agreement, and then I pay for the program out of those monies, because there's a good chance that they'll draw down more money than they need, and therefore be out of compliance because they'll have no backup documentation for what they drew down. If HUD comes to call, they'll take that money back, okay? At fair market rent is what FMR stands for, okay? So each project that is doing rental assistance and leasing must have a calculation of rent reasonableness as well as be within the fair market rent. If it's a rental assistance program, it can go above fair market rent, but it must show that the rent is reasonable. So rent reasonableness means that in every client file, there should be a triangulation of a couple of different units paid or that were available. So for instance, a one-bedroom unit in a county goes for, according to fair market rent, maybe the fair market rent is $1,000. But realistically, $1,000 is not enough to pay for rental assistance for a one-bedroom unit maybe. So I can go up to 1,050 or 1,060 maybe if I can show HUD, oh, look, here's a listing of 4 different apartments. This is the apartment that I leased up for my client at 1,060. And you can see how reasonable it is because just in this Camden County area or Cumberland County or Cape May or Gloucester, that you can see that these other listings show that you can spend $1,100 on a similar, modest but well provisioned one-bedroom unit. So that's rent reasonableness. There should be documentation of that in each client file. Okay, program drawdown from ELOCs at least quarterly. You must have at least quarterly drawdowns in order to be in compliance with HUD's policy. Okay, so keep that in mind. So if there's not quarterly drawdowns in what you see, then it's an issue. Okay. Inspections are annually. I got a question for the inspections of units. It should be inspected annually. There is a HUD HQS standard form, but sometimes people use the Public Housing Authority inspection form. There's usually a standard form that should be in there showing what people are reviewing when they do the inspection, and it should be signed and dated by whoever is carrying out that inspection. If it's more than 12 months old, it's usually done within, when the lease is renewed. So you should just check and see that folks are doing that. Recent grant closeout certification, we already said we need to do that. Agency's accounting system matches drawdown amounts. Do they have a list of invoices? Maybe, every time I have to draw down the administrative monies to justify my staff expense for operating the program, I basically have to show internally in my accounting software that I'm going to bill HUD for my time, right? So it goes with the timesheet, it has an expenditure, and that's what's potentially justifying the expenses that I'm drawing down from HUD. Whatever it is, in terms of in terms of rental assistance, right? The documentation of eligible expenses is the lease agreements, right? So if I have a valid lease between, the tenant and a landlord, I know that all of the rental assistance monies that I draw down are eligible. That's a valid, piece of documentation. For other expenses such as support services or operations, you'll want to see what exactly those expenses are going to and how they justify the drawdowns. Appropriate training and experience, again, you can kind of go by the job description, but also you can check out the staff, interview them, or see what their qualifications are. You can interview staff and make sure that they feel like they're adequately prepared, right? Is this program operating well, and do the staff think that it's operating well? And do they have supervision and guidance? This is not, again, to call out the agencies, but ultimately the CoC is co-responsible for the operation of these projects. If we have grantees that have no idea what they're doing, then HUD is ultimately going to come back to us and say, why are you awarding money to people who don't know how to operate a program and then not helping them operate the program better? Because we are partially a technical assistance provider as a community. So, all important considerations. All right, so moving on, just want to make sure that everybody is clear with these labels. We got standard met, standard not met. Again, what I said is I was using tallies if I'm doing it as a percentage of the client files that I've reviewed. Yes, no, and not applicable. Again, for chronic homelessness, it may not be applicable. You may not have to look for documentation of chronic homelessness because maybe the program doesn't have to serve the chronically homeless, right? So you'll have to cross-reference that grant agreement as well, or excuse me, the grant application with the information that you're looking for in these files. All right, so that's what we were planning to go through in terms of our scoring tool. our monitoring tool. I know that this doesn't answer every question that will possibly arise. I would encourage you to feel free to ask questions to the people that you are working with and monitoring. If you're looking at a client file, you have no idea what you're looking at, just feel free to ask. You know, ultimately, I've seen monitoring visits go way better when the person who is doing the monitoring is a first-time monitor than sometimes when they've done it all their lives. Because guess what? It gives the person who is providing that service or providing the files and the documentation of the way the program is operating a chance to explain how they're operating it, you know, and it provides an opportunity to have a dialogue and educate monitors as well as ensure that the program's operating in compliance. I'm just going to open up the floor one last time and see if anybody has any questions they want to send through the cyberspace into the question bar, or if you want to just speak it out onto the phone line. So I'll just wait a couple seconds. Anybody out there? How about instead of questions, any concerns? Or this is my client satisfaction survey, okay? So if does anybody feel they're totally unprepared and they need something else to feel prepared? Okay, I'm going to take that as an encouragement, but I really do want to just not preclude the possibility that someone out there really just still feels like, well, I got a lot of information, but it's not necessarily, you know, I know that I'm going to have more questions when I start, and I thank you for those folks who did write that said it seems like you're prepared, you feel like nothing else is needed, but don't feel guilty, don't feel silly asking questions of somebody else in your monitoring group when you go to do the monitoring, or again, asking the person who you are having this conversation with. Our goal as a CoC is not to be, holding people to the fire. You know, we are really just trying to make sure that they're using the monies in compliance, that they are prepared to operate the program well, that it's serving consumers in the way that it should, and that, God forbid, if HUD ever came to call on them, that they would be prepared, that they would know that they are in compliance. And because, you know, we do want to hold people to account if necessary, but we also really just want to make sure that we're educating our providers, because let's face it, this is a difficult group in some cases to serve, the folks who are being housed through these monies, and they are doing a great amount of work, and hopefully they're doing it the right way. We just want to make sure that that's all together. So as I stated before, this presentation will be available as a webinar to view for others who have not been able to join us today. Not hearing or seeing any further questions, I'm going to sign off and hope that if there's anything else you need, that you can come back and address me directly, or you can reach out to CPAC and they can pass along the information to me. We'll address it together. So thank you. Thank you for your willingness to serve as a monitor for SNJ CoC. And I hope you all enjoyed the rest of this very, very warm day. And we'll see you soon at a monitoring visit close to you. All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great one.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, you too.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.